Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here with us again. Tonight's discussion is going to be about Pacific Ocean Park Pier. And tonight we got Domenic Priore and Chris Merritt. And I can tell you from the rehearsals with these guys and from our back and forth leading up to this program that they're an awful lot of fun. You're in for a treat tonight. Southern California native Christopher Merritt has over 25 years of ride and show design experience, creating theme park attractions and environments around the world. He has served as an art director and productions designer at theme parks in California, Florida, Tokyo, Singapore, and Shanghai. In 2010, Chris's Knott's Berry Farm pictorial history, Knott's Preserved, was published to critical acclaim. 2014 saw the release of Pacific Ocean Park, the rise and fall of Los Angeles' space-age nautical pleasure pier. Along with co-author Domenic Priore, after 5 years of research and design, co-authoring with Pete Docter, the coffee table book, Mark Davis, in his own words, Imagineering the Disney Theme Parks is out now. Chris currently lives in Southern California and is a lead show designer with Walt Disney Imagineering. Domenic Priore is a writer and television producer specializing in pop culture and music. He is the author of Riot on the Sunset Strip, Rock and Roll's Last Stand in Hollywood, with a foreword by Arthur Lee of Love. Beatsville with Martin McIntosh, pop surf culture, music design, film, and fashion from the Bohemian surf boom with Brian Chidester, and Smile, the story of Brian Wilson's last masterpiece with forwards by Brian Wilson and Van Dyke Parks. As a result of that project, Domenic wrote the liner notes, sourced photographs, and helped sequence the music of the Beach Boys' Smile Sessions box set from Capitol Records, which won the 2013 Grammy for Best Historical Album. He was also the main writer on the AMC documentaries Hollywood Rocks the Movies, the early years 1955 to 1970, hosted by Ringo Starr, and Hollywood Rocks the Movies, the 1970s, hosted by David Bowie. A Los Angeles native, Priore has returned to Southern California after living in New York City and San Francisco. I promised you these guys were going to be a lot of fun. Please welcome Chris Merritt and Domenic Priore.
So now when people think of Pacific Ocean Park, sometimes they'll say, oh, it was like Disneyland. But Disneyland was too sophisticated to have a ride like the Rotor. Yes, it was the Magic Kingdom for children of all ages, but past a certain age, P.O.P is where you'd want to be.
So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I am Christopher Merritt, and I am here with my co-author, Domenic Priore, and we are going to talk this evening about our book that we wrote several years ago called Pacific Ocean Park, The Rise and Fall of Los Angeles' Space-Age Nautical Pleasure Pier. And it is pretty appropriate that we're doing this for the Santa Monica History Museum this evening, because this all goes back to a great amount of history in Santa Monica, starting with this gentleman. This gentleman is Abbot Kinney. Mr. Kinney was the creator of Ocean Park in Venice of America, and he had a dream. He wanted to bring a cultural center to Los Angeles with fun zones, canals, a pleasure pier, scenic railways, bands, and dancing. And it's interesting because he was successful in that early on. This is the Grand Lagoon and Midway Plaisance in Venice, and there were all sorts of little strange attractions you could experience alongside it. So there are things called like the Chicken Farm, Darkness and Dawn, and it all kind of revolves around these piers that go up. Now, like Rob had mentioned before, there were several piers in Santa Monica, not just the Santa Monica Pier, which is the only really one left today. But one of the first big piers, you can see in the background there, this is a shot from the 1920s. That's the Ocean Park Pier. And that actually, its beginnings go back to 1895, if you can believe that. Here's the Ocean Park Pier Boardwalk with the Dome Theater.
Dome plays big in a story.
That's right. The Dome Theater is a good part of this. And then right next door, another second pier that was butted up right against the Ocean Park Pier was known as the Lick Pier. and this is it in 1929. That Lick Pier goes back to late 1921. So it's kind of interesting because both of these piers put together are going to create basically the landing pad for Pacific Ocean Park in the 1950s. There were all sorts of amazing and interesting things to do and see on the Ocean Park Pier. This is the Ocean Park Auditorium in the 1920s, where they would have band concerts, of course, when the weather was permitting.
And later it became the Westinghouse Pavilion at P.O.P.
That's right. And then they imported a lot of these rides that were very similar, if not exact clones to their counterparts in Coney Island on the East Coast. So this is the Virginia Reel, kind of a nauseating ride in a tub down around these sharp hairpin curves. And one that really fascinates us are scenic railways. Now, this is the Dragon's Gorge Scenic Railway that was owned and operated by the L.A. Thompson Corporation. And they actually had an almost identical version of this at Coney Island on the East Coast. But scenic railways are interesting to us because they really are kind of primordial dark rides or dark ride experiences, like you say. So if you see up at the top, this is another scenic railway that L.A. Thompson Company had. You see there's a little tunnel they're going into. And a lot of these early attractions, I wouldn't call them roller coasters because they had very gentle dips and turns, but you would go into these tunnels and there'd be little scenes or vignettes with lights that would come on. So it's kind of the early predecessor of what we know as themed dark ride attractions today.
In this picture, it looks a lot like Mystery Island at P.O.P. later on.
That's right. There's an amazing attraction at P.O.P. called Mystery Island Banana Train Ride. We'll get into in a bit. There were also all sorts of strange things up and down throughout Ocean Park in Santa Monica. This was a little walk-through fun house called the Bug House. There was also a little walk-through exhibit called the Noah's Ark Fun House, and there are many of these that were made and created across the United States in the 1920s.
Chaplin did a very funny film there.
That's right, he did. And there were even shockingly racist attractions like this Chinatown slums walkthrough. I think it was kind of a wax museum thing. So there were all sorts of strange things going on in Ocean Park at this time. Now, for those of you who have studied any sort of piers or amusement parks on piers, you know they tend to burn down a lot. And that actually did happen in 1924. Both the Ocean Park Pier and the Lick Pier caught fire and burned straight to the ground. But within the next year, they were already rebuilding and bringing it back. So that's the 1920s and 30s. They kind of chugged along. So what happened in the 1940s? Well, before we talk about what it was like in the 1940s, we have to mention this gentleman. This is Charles Doc Strube. He is the father of the Turf Club Association, otherwise known as Santa Anita. And he got his start up in the Bay Area. He was known as the, quote, dentist with the golden drill. He was an entrepreneur and a businessman who wanted to build an amusement park to rival Disneyland. He also owned and operated the Santa Anita racetrack, which he basically ruled with an iron fist, as far as we know. So he had a dream. He wanted to build his own amusement park / theme park. And so by the 1950s, he starts looking at Ocean Park Pier. It turns out Ocean Park Pier was purchasable at that time. And these are the kind of things that you would see in the 1940s and early 50s in Ocean Park Pier. One thing that's interesting to Dominic and I is that dancing was practically outlawed in Los Angeles at the time. So there were a lot of these big casino gardens dancing, for example, where you could have big bands, right, Dominic?
Yeah, the laws in Los Angeles, they were trying to stop exploitation of teenagers and young people. So it was really strict. And so most of the Danceland ballrooms were out by the beach in the old days.
They also were very popular with tourists. They had annual bathing beauty contests like this one. But the real fun happened on the Midway. So the entrance to the Ocean Park Pier, you actually walked underneath this hotel that was adjacent to the Dome Theater Dominic mentioned before, and it was kind of this dark underpass. But once you went out into the sunlight, it was very much a traditional carny kind of operated pier midway. And we love some of these shots. You can almost like smell the popcorn cooking.
It's a World War II era picture there.
Right. And it was also very popular with sailors who were on shore leave at the time. Back in the background there, you can see a sign that says High Boy. High Boy was this very exciting, very rough roller coaster that was designed by John Miller. And then right behind the High Boy back there, you see there's kind of this tall tower. That was known as the Bamboo Slide. And you would have to make your way all the way up to the top, and they would give you mats and you would slide down. So again, very not dissimilar from what you'd experience at your local fair or your local carnival, kind of off-the-shelf things. This is a really interesting attraction that we'll revisit later. This is called the Stratoliner, and it's kind of this big girder erector set ride. And the idea was you would get in these quote-unquote rockets, and as the whole contraption started spinning around, force of gravity would pull them out to the sides, and so it would feel like you're flying. And then Dominic, there's an interesting building behind it, right?
Yeah, the little yellow building underneath it, next to the tilt-a-whirl there, is called the Egyptian Ballroom, and it had, you know, a variety of dance acts. There was a casino gardens in front and the Egyptian Ballrooms in the back, and you know, Ritchie Valens played there when that became Buccaneers Den at P.O.P.
That's right. It's also kind of strange because at a certain point, some of these attractions on the pier, someone decided them with an Art Deco motif. So on the right here, this little walk-through mirror maze is called the Bug House. And again, it had kind of an Art Deco look. And then there was a dark ride known as Spooks. Now, both of these attractions, the roller coaster, the Stratoliner, these are all attractions that would actually continue on into Pacific Ocean Park. They would just strangely rename them with nautically themed titles to the rides. But in a lot of cases, they were exactly the same as they were on the pier in the 1940s. This is really bizarre. Dominic and I want to go back in time and visit this. This is a walk-through funhouse called Tunerville. And there's something about it that just scares me. It had this giant Joe E. Brown head out front, and it almost looks like a Toontown at Disneyland sort of a thing with wacky buildings that are falling over. But one of the most interesting things that got people to come out to Ocean Park on the Lick Pier side of things was the Aragon Ballroom, right, Dominic?
Yeah, the Aragon Ballroom was on the left side of the pier close to the beach, and there had always been in that location a little bandstand as far back as like the 1895 when they opened the pier. They put a little bandstand next to the pier. And so it just through the years, as many times as it burned down, they kept on rebuilding the ballroom. And Frank Sinatra with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra played there. Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys played there. Harry Owens and the Royal Hawaiians played there. So it was an ideal place. And in the 50s, Lawrence Welk became the house band there. And then he had his television show on KTLA, I believe. And that made the Ocean Park Pier popular again. And that's what Doc Strube said, okay, this place is viable. Let's try to do something with it.
Right. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't mention these two gentlemen who were a great help to Doc Strube. On the left, that's Ben Odoricio, and on the right, that's Bill Janes. And they were kind of a frick and frack type group. They actually started being called Bill and Ben by everyone because they would talk simultaneously. They would answer each other's questions when someone had a question. And the way they were discovered is back during World War II, the US Army actually commandeered Santa Anita. So these two were young officers at the time, and Doc Strube really took a shine to them, liked them, and so he actually hired them at the end of World War II to come work with them. This is Bill and Ben.
Great shot of them at Jack's at the Beach, a celebrity restaurant out at P.O.P. that was on part of the Ocean Park thing. It just evolved into P.O.P.
Yeah, I love the decorations on the wall behind them.
We'll see a little more of it later.
Yeah, so basically Bill and Ben helped facilitate things like developing Lake Arrowhead into a viable tourist destination. So these guys were a natural to help Doc Strube with this amusement park project. And basically what they did was they took 50% funding from Santa Anita, the Turf Club, and then they sweet-talked CBS, the television station, into paying for half of it. And this was at an assumed cost of $3 million, which they would blow that cost handily once they got into production. But that was the idea. So one of the first things they did was they hired the architectural firm Pereira and Luckman. And those of you who like 1950s design, Pereira and Luckman designed Marineland. They designed quite a lot of the Googie coffee shops that you would see around town. And so this is kind of an overview concept they did of what the park could look like if they bought both piers and combined everything all together into one amusement park. It's also interesting, too, that the city of Santa Monica were very much boosters of Pacific Ocean Park when it was in development. They even went so far as to come up with a character. This character up on the upper left, that's Monnie the Mermaid, spelled M-O-N-N-I-E, i.e. like Santa Monica, Monnie the Mermaid, haha. So it's interesting because the city of Santa Monica really got behind promoting this, and in later years, not so much, as you'll see. So once they had funding in hand, they went ahead and they went into conceptual design. So we really love the concept art of Pacific Ocean Park. It's one of the first things that drew me to it when I became interested in it. It's just really gorgeous mid-century modern design. And they did the same thing that Walt Disney did. They hired a lot of motion picture art directors from the studio system to come in and design because they knew theatrical design. This is a piece of concept art by Fred Harpman. Now, Fred was baby-faced for sure and only 30 years old when he got the job as basically the creative design director for all of Pacific Ocean Park. It's a big deal. And it's interesting because a lot of people will come up to Dominic and I and look at that entrance to P.O.P. that was designed and say, oh, they just ripped off the LAX theme building. But actually, this was designed 4 years before the theme building was created. So
and it should be mentioned, Pierre and Luckman did have a hand in the LA airport theme building, so it was probably carried over.
I would imagine so, yeah.
Yeah.
So it has this streamlined modern architecture, 1950s Googie influence that we just love. Some of the other people who worked very closely on P.O.P., and there were many, many. This is Dorothea and Maurice Ayres up in the upper left, and Dorothea's brothers, Bud Drager and Don Drager. All of these people came out of the studio system, and basically Maurice ends up pretty much in charge of Neptune's Kingdom, the first attraction you will see in Pacific Ocean Park. This is the Coca-Cola C Lounge, which was kind of the waiting area to get into Neptune's Kingdom when you entered. And again, this is a ladies' powder room for the Coca-Cola C Lounge, and boy, I wish we had that bottom shot in color, but talk about 1950s streamlined modern influence. It very much has that look to it. So the idea behind Neptune's Kingdom, for those of you who don't know, was that you were actually going to be walking along inside a show building that looked like you were looking out to the ocean, and then you would go in a tunnel underneath and you would see scenes of oceanic sea life. What it eventually turns into is a trip in an elevator under the sea, and you would have portholes where you would look, or actually viewing windows where you would look and you would see actual aquariums, fish, real sea life, and then the very big ending of it, you can see in that big space at the top of the rendering, you'd have a visit with King Neptune himself, and you'd see his undersea kingdom, and that would all be mechanical. This is the undersea elevator. The idea was everyone would come inside and they would close the doors. And there was this kind of screw gear in the middle that would fill with water and bubbles, and it was supposed to make you feel like you were actually going underneath the ocean.
When I was a kid, I went to this, and I really believed that I was underneath the ocean and seeing all those things for real. But I was 2 years old.
By all accounts, it was a pretty effective trick. This is an early elevation showing how the animated King Neptune and some of the fish and other creatures could be. And again, this is a technique we call in the industry dry for wet, where there's actually not really water in there, but there's lighting and effects and things that make you feel like you're looking into an area that's under the water. Another big draw that they wanted to have was something called the Sea Circus, where you would see dolphins and seals and porpoises perform. Their answer to Disneyland's Autopia was the Union Oil Company Ocean Highway, where you'd get in cars and you drive out on the end of the pier. And then a really unique concept that a couple of brothers came up with, this is called the Flight to Mars. Now, there was an attraction at Disneyland called the Rocket to the Moon, where you blasted off and you never actually quite made it to the moon and came back to Earth. This attraction, you were actually going to get in a spaceship and fly up to Mars and get out and walk around and look out at the polar ice caps, or see strange creatures like these snapping clams and ice snails, which we still don't know what they are. And this was supposed to be in Earthman's living quarters. So there was very strange things that you would see as you walked along. This is supposed to be a Martian gold mine. Another dark ride that they proposed was called the Magic Carpet, which was kind of a overhead suspended trip through fairy tales.
Just like the Steppenwolf song.
That's right.
Your Met
And,
Carpet, right?
and then out front, you had the International Promenade, which would have a lot of souvenir shops and restaurants with an international theme. They took the old Highboy roller coaster and they renamed it the Sea Serpent. And then there was a dark ride they came up with called the Sea Tub Adventure, which was kind of like a tunnel of love sort of experience. You get in these big brown sea tubs and travel and get almost run over by giant ships, and you get attacked by a giant octopus. So this is all pretty interesting stuff. And then on the Lick Pier side, they actually came up with a food and beverage area they called Fisherman's Cove. And the idea behind that would be that it was based on Cape Cod, New England architecture, kind of a calm, more serene environment.
And then that little place right there, that's where later in the 70s, when surfers would go into that little pit there in the pier and try to shoot those pilings, to shoot the pier. That became famous in the Dogtown and Z-Boys movie, but this is the best shot we have of what the entrance to that surfing iconic place looks like.
Yeah, later when you get into the early 70s, apparently there was something about the way the waves hit those pilings that made it like the best surfing place in Southern California. Another interesting attraction that they came up with, all the art directors on Pacific Ocean Park pooled their resources so they could own and operate their own custom designed dark ride. It was called the Deepest Deep. It was going to be inside a metal Quonset hut, if you can believe that. And the idea was that you would get in these submersible diving bells, and you were going to go and you're going to look out for this long lost beachcomber who had a treasure, and he buried the treasure somewhere in the ocean. And so you would go under the waves looking for the treasure, and you get attacked by horrible monsters like this one right here. Pretty advanced, but probably the absolute do not miss high-end e-ticket attraction at Pacific Ocean Park was the Mystery Island Banana Train ride. And just from the get-go, it was amazing. Talk about Polynesian pop. So you actually went over this trestle, over a waterfall, and you got on these little banana trains, and these little banana trains would actually push you out into the jungle, and you would get menaced by exploding volcanoes. There were coconut throwing chimpanzees that tried to hit your train as you went by. And this is art director Dave Constable on the left, who did a lot of the concept art, and sculptor Jim Casey on the right. Jim is actually sculpting one of these coconut throwing monkeys that would take place basically in the attraction later. And then at the end of a ride, you get approached by this creature they called the Gooney Bird. And the Gooney Bird was this strange, fanciful bird that would pop out of a clutch of eggs and scream, "I hope you enjoyed your trip," over and over again as you left. So the concept art for P.O.P. is amazing. Again, I keep saying streamlined modern, but it's definitely got that very 1950s look to it. You know, all the men are wearing jackets, all the women are wearing dresses, sometimes with white gloves.
And this is Jack's at the Beach, right?
This is at Jack's at the Beach, and selling that idea of romance, you know, and tropical romance, and even seeing Catalina Island off in the distance out there. We just love this stuff.
The Mystery Island right there.
Yeah. So they had their plans in hand, they had their concept art, a lot of working drawings, of course, were done, and construction walls went up on the pier in 1958. And earlier in the year, they'd actually been doing production. This is a sculptor, Irvine Friege. There were these giant fiberglass seahorses that were outside of Pacific Ocean Park. And amazingly, when the pandemic's over, if any of you can go visit the Santa Monica History Museum, they actually have one of these that survived mounted on the wall, which is amazing. They went ahead and they built a false kind of a shell outside the old Ocean Park Auditorium, which had a very 1920s kind of Baroque look to it. And you'll see why.
It's the oldest thing on the pier.
That's right. You'll see when you get to opening just what a stylized, bold entry statement this whole entrance into Pacific Ocean Park was. It was also huge. I mean, look at the size on that. It's interesting too, the Casino Gardens Ballroom was actually turned into a production facility at that time, where the Draeger brothers were busy making all the sea life that you would experience in Neptune's Kingdom. So this is a artificial starfish being pulled from a plaster mold. So they did a lot of their work right there on the pier, which is not necessarily usual until you get closer to opening. This is sculptor Joseph Lanzar. He's working on the full-size clay sculpt of King Neptune, and he got a football star from UCLA to pose for him for it. And then Jim Casey, in addition to doing all sorts of interesting sculptures, he did these weird wall carvings that were going to go on the Flight to Mars attraction. And to me, they almost look like they're straight out of a Shag illustration. Don't you think so?
Yeah, definitely Shag.
This is the facade for the Sea Tub Adventure under construction. And Jim Casey, the sculptor we saw earlier who designed and sculpted this, said he designed the octopus to look like Eisenhower's big bald head. So that's actually a thinly veiled caricature of Ike on the wall there, acting as a octopus of some sort.
And a Get Smart shot outside of there. Don Adams said, "There's gollywoggles in there," or something.
That's right. Yeah, there's lots of TV shows that are shot in the 1960s at P.O.P. later on. Here's Sal Mineo and Sandra Dee on the Cape Cod end of the pier. There were a couple of weird sculptures that Jim Casey did of George Washington and Martha Washington that flanked the restrooms for some reason. So you'll see a lot of Pacific Ocean Park photographs that have celebrities in them. That's because Fred Hartman and all the art directors were so tied into the motion picture studio system, it was almost too easy for them to get celebrities to come and do photo ops. Here they are, just a few weeks away from opening, and you can see things are not quite ready to go yet, but this is how it always seems to be when opening theme park attractions. You're rushing at the last minute. Jim Casey was busy carving tiki posts out of telephone poles on the pier with an axe, if you can believe that. And again, he really kind of nailed that Polynesian pop, mid-century modern interpretation of tiki in Polynesia.
There it is, that tunnel.
There, that's right. So this is the Mystery Island Banana Train under construction, which is just looks like a nightmare. That circular tunnel that we saw in the background, that was actually meant to replicate an earthquake in the attraction. And those of you who are old enough, you might remember that Universal Studios tour in California used to have a rotating ice tunnel at one point. So this was the predecessor of that. They called the whole construction for the Mystery Island Banana Train the Carpenter's Nightmare, and you can see why. The way they did their rock work was interesting. They basically took a bunch of 2x4s and nailed them all together at crazy angles, draped the whole thing with chicken wire, and then hosed the whole thing down with shotcrete and gunite, and that's what made the quote-unquote rock work for the Mystery Island Banana Train. Here's some of those coconut throwing monkeys ready to be put in the attraction that Jim sculpted. And there was also a cannibal that would hang upside down from a thatched hut that would menace you. There were also carnivorous vultures at various parts of the ride. And then this is the clay sculpture for the Gooney Bird we will see later, who will pop out of this clutch of eggs and scream at you.
Right here, how close it is to the old scenic railway idea.
Yeah, it's definitely in the same mode as that, for sure. So in 1958, grand opening of Pacific Ocean Park happened. They took out nationwide, coast-to-coast advertisements, and we just really love the font and the graphic design behind the early advertisements and the colors behind it. They're so bold, they're kind of in your face, but again, very mid-century modern to me. And they did it. They actually built a fully immersive working theme park by combining two piers together, reappropriating some of the old Carney kind of attractions and retheming them, and also coming up with brand new ones that no one had ever seen before. So on opening day, this actually rivaled Disneyland for basically ticket for the gate, which is interesting. The grand opening ceremonies, of course, were star-studded, a lot of celebrities. And this is kind of a fun picture. There's a lot of Turf Club member executives on the left. They had an admiral and Bill and Ben, of course. But in the middle there, that's Lawrence Welk. And on the far right, that is Leo Carrillo. And they are turning the spigots open to start the water flowing at the entrance to Pacific.
And the one guy you don't see in that picture is Doc Strube, because he passed away before Pacific Ocean Park was really open. So Bill and Ben were kind of on their own. And later they had problems with CBS and doing things different. So P.O.P was, without Strube, it was kind of missing its way after a while.
Yeah, it sure was. It's too bad because Strube worked so hard to make this happen, and he died several months before it opened, unfortunately. So the entrance to P.O.P. was a really grand entrance statement. You know, when you say entrance statement, every theme park today kind of has one, some sort of big impressive thing that you see right upon experiencing it, getting you ready for all the adventures that you're going to go on. This is the ticket gates with the giant rotating fiberglass seahorses. And to me, the entrance is just a really, really bold artistic statement, really beautiful. And I think it looks like it was especially beautiful when the sun went down and nighttime lighting would come on.
Sunsets, forget it. Yeah, I mean, yep. Santa Monica Mountains.
Yep, just gorgeous. Here's kind of an overhead shot from one of the adjacent buildings showing you just kind of how clean and streamlined it was, especially with all those, the water coming down the edge. There was a specialized water show as you walked in. They called it Aqua Techniques, whatever that means. But I think it was supposed to be the aquatic version of fireworks. And you had bubbles and things that were spraying and shooting up and down. There's this stylized King Neptune sculpture. And all of this was pointing the way to the first thing you were supposed to experience at P.O.P., which was Neptune's Kingdom. So let's follow the crowd into the show building and kind of see what it would have been like to experience that. Here's the Coca-Cola C Lounge, and they had a giant spinning lamp that was called the Sea Anemone lamp. And you worked your way back towards the elevators that would take you down underneath the ocean. Along the way, you did see these very stylized tile mural depictions of ocean life, which again, I think the design is really, really interesting and definitely of its time. From there, you'd go underneath the ocean and you'd walk out. You'd see various real fish and aquatic specimens in the windows. And then you'd make your way to Neptune's Kingdom, which was the big hero money shot at the end of the attraction. This is Maurice Ayres actually standing in the middle of Neptune's throne room, but you can see all the people lined up against the window to look, and there were all sorts of animated sharks, and there was actually a sawfish, and there was a crawling starfish that would move over the rocks, and then back in the background you would see an animated King Neptune who was, he was animated but moved very slowly, and he was kind of surveying his domain. So Neptune's Kingdom set the bar really high for your day at Pacific Ocean Park. And from there, you'd walk out into the sunlight. And one of the first things you would see would be the Westinghouse Enchanted Forest. So you'll see there are quite a few corporate sponsored attractions at P.O.P. The Westinghouse Enchanted Forest was no exception. And one of the interesting things is before you went in to see the show, they had this kind of goofy robot. This robot was actually known as Electro, a mechanical man. He was actually first seen in the 1939 New York World's Fair. And so somehow they dug him out of mothballs and put him out, and he would talk to you and tell you what you'd see in the Westinghouse exhibit. And once you got inside the Westinghouse exhibit, you saw basically a live show hosted by a young married couple known as Jack and Jill. And they were talking about how wonderful it was in the 1950s to be young and married, but gee, we need all these appliances. And every time they'd mention something like, I need a convection oven or I need a refrigerator, the Westinghouse equivalent would pop up as the house built itself around them, and they'd sing this little song. And then after that, strangely enough, and there's a lot that's strange at Pacific Ocean Park, you would walk through a recreation of the USS Nautilus Submarine, which was the first atomic submarine built in the 1950s. How this went along with Westinghouse and appliances, I have no idea. But maybe it was playing on the nuclear energy idea of things. But that's what.
You know why they had that Navy guy on opening day? Oh, the Navy, Nautilus. You know, it was kind of a big deal to kids. You know.
That's right. Yeah. And they worked with the Navy when they designed that too. I think another don't miss attraction at P.O.P. would have been the Sea Circus, which was directly outside. So there was, it wasn't covered, you were right in the sun, but you were in these bleachers and you got to see seals and dolphins and other walruses perform. And you're right there on the beautiful Santa Monica Bay.
That stage right there is where Wink Martindale did the P.O.P. dance party too later.
That's right. And they were not as sensitive to animal cruelty or animal rights back then, shall we say. They thought they wanted to have a pink elephant, so they actually got this baby elephant from Thailand and spray painted it pink, which was not the best idea for the animal's health. And you'll see a lot of the early promotional footage. It'll have this chimpanzee, his name was Dink. He was trained and he was actually in the show quite a lot too. Another attraction that's interesting at P.O.P. was the diving bells. And this goes back to the 1940s on the pier. They just repurposed it. The idea was that you would queue up and then you would go inside these big metal containers that would go down underneath the water, supposedly the ocean, but of course not, for a minute or so. And then you would violently pop back up to the surface, making it feel like you were way down deep under the ocean. And of course it would douse everybody and everyone would scream. There was a seal pool where you could hand feed the seals. And then their answer to Disneyland's Skyway was called the Ocean Sky Ride. And you got in these bubbles. It was actually developed by the Von Roll system, who made a lot of ski lift chairs. And you would go out over the ocean and you would work your way all the way out to Mystery Island and back again. Imagineer Tony Baxter told us that he said he was terrified riding this as a kid, because if something happened and the bubble like fell off the wire, you were locked in, so you would slowly drown. So probably not the best idea.
It never happened though, but it was one of the most memorable parts of the park that people remembered. It was almost like that's why we called Space Age Nautical. It was very space age, that ride.
Especially at night. I would imagine it would have been really magical at night to go out over the ocean and back and again. Yeah. Here is the Ocean Highway, which of course, again, is a Autopia kind of a ripoff, and they didn't have any guide rails, so they ended up crashing and bumping around into each other a lot. And to us, one of the most interesting attractions was the Flight to Mars. Again, it doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the nautical theme, but let's take a look at the Flight to Mars and listen to some of the audio that you would hear while waiting in the queue.
Welcome aboard Spaceway rocket liner Starshine. As we only use artificial gravity in space, you will experience acceleration in the first few moments of blastoff. Starshine to tower, preparing for blastoff. Tower to Starshine, your launching pad clear.
Yeah, so you actually got in a spaceship and quote unquote blasted off and walked around the surface of Mars. You would see these little vignettes, these little show windows that would show you going off in the distance, like what the polar ice caps look like in Mars. You would see strange Martian creatures. You would go by an Earthman's living quarters as interpreted by the people of Mars, I guess. And then these are some of these weird Jim Casey bas-relief kind of sculptures that you would see of Martian creatures as you walked out. Another interesting attraction was the dark ride, the Magic Carpet, which was built at the back of the old Dome Theater. So you can see how tall it is on the back there. That's because it was basically backstage, the wings of the old Dome Theater. And out front of this dark ride, they had a gentleman, a very large gentleman known as Big Tiny Little, and he wore a fez and he would try and talk people into riding the Magic Carpet. The Magic Carpet was a kind of strange. It was an overhead suspended attraction, not unlike the Peter Pan ride at Disneyland, on these carpets. And the idea was that you would see recreations of tales from both Arabian Nights, but also from Mother Goose stories. So this is a photo of the Jack and the Beanstalk scene where basically the giant is menacing Jack climbing the beanstalk right there. There are hardly any photos of the inside of this thing, so it's interesting to see at least one. And there's Zsa Zsa Gabor and family riding on opening day with Big Tiny Little sitting in the back. And then out front, now this is interesting, you didn't have to pay to get in this area. It was kind of on the boardwalk. It was called the International Promenade, right, Dominic?
Yeah, on the lower right, if you look at this place, it's called the Limelight. And that was like a 1920s flapper era themed bar. So if you were at P.O.P. and you're an adult and you want to have a drink, you walk outside underneath the Dome Theater, you go out, you go to the Chinese restaurant, they're serving drinks there. So, but they had a wide variety of international foods there, but I think we're all made in the same kitchen, right? They just changed the sauces.
That's right.
But here's the Seahorse Inn. It was a British themed restaurant. And later it became a nightclub. After the Cheetah closed, it was called the Beach House. So the Flying Burrito Brothers played there and stuff. Canned Heat. But yeah, International Promenade restaurants were Spanish, Leo Carrillo, Milani's Italian restaurant, the German restaurant, Cantonese restaurant, 20s nightclub, French, English delicatessen, and the English restaurant Seahorse Inn. So yeah.
So if you wanted to get a stiff drink, you had to actually go outside P.O.P. and get it and then come back in. But let's take a look back in. So back in Pacific Ocean Park, you know, after you've experienced some of these things like Flight to Mars, there was the very long section of the pier called the Midway. So again, the Midway was pretty much the same location it always was. The attractions were just upgraded quite a bit. But you can see it still had kind of a carnival flair to it. So it's interesting when they're going to such lengths to make these immersive theme park attractions that would really take on Disneyland. And then you've got something that's kind of basically carny level like this. This is kind of interesting too. On the left, you'll see this kind of blob with a bunch of little, you know, I don't know, little blob shapes painted on it. Those are supposed to be ocean waves. So
yeah,
the execution was not always the best at P.O.P.
They were going to put that mermaid thing we'll see later at that spot next to the Flying Dutchman ride.
There's the roller coaster in the background underneath the sea tub ride. You can see the sea tub ride was not actually in that big of a building. It was kind of a quick attraction. And then here's the old Highboy roller coaster rethemed as the Sea Serpent. Now, again, this goes with the longstanding tradition of P.O.P. taking existing things from the pier, calling it something nautical, but it really was the same exact roller coaster as it was going back to the 1940s.
Yeah, I love the stretching of that concept. It's like the ocean deep blue, you know.
Right. Here's the quote unquote Pirates Maze, which again, I don't know what it had to do with pirates, with these terrifying clowns out front. And it was a walk-through mirror maze. And that's Tony Dow and Cheryl Holdridge there navigating it on the left.
From Leave It to Beaver.
That's right.
And this is the rotor I spoke of earlier. A lot of people might remember this particular ride from the Truffaut film, The 400 Blows. If we look at the next slide, you'll get to see on the right-hand side, that's the guy, Max Bayer, who played Jethro Bodine on the Beverly Hillbillies, plastered up against the wall there. How'd the ride work, Chris?
So for those of you who haven't experienced this at a carnival, the idea was you would basically step inside. It's almost like walking inside a washing machine, this circular tub, and you would start to slowly spin in one direction. And as you started to slowly spin, it would get faster and faster, and the floor would drop out. And what would happen is the centrifugal force would make you stick to the wall. And so everyone would kind of scream and go nuts, and they'd go faster and slower. Again, a typical carny kind of attraction. Right next door to that rotor drop is a bug nuts attraction called the Safari Dark Ride, which is kind of a typical bus bar little dark ride with jungle animals, but they gave you rifles to shoot the animals with as you went through, which is definitely would not do today. There was also an off-the-shelf bumper car that they rethemed as the quote-unquote Sea Ram. Okay, there's our.
That's one of my favorite rethemings, by the way.
Yeah, the Sea Ram. Okay, what's a Sea Ram? We don't know. We have no idea. And then they had a completely unthemed carousel, but the neat thing about the carousel, it was actually owned and operated by the famous Illians family. For those of you who know about carousel horses, the Illians family are quite famous, going back to the late 1800s in terms of carving carousel horses. And Rudy and Joe Illians actually worked there, and they set up a little machine shop in the back. So anytime they had a mechanical problem, they could actually make their own tools, their own parts, and fix it right there on the spot. It's kind of interesting.
And it's cool that carousels had been part of the Venice Pier and the Ocean Park Pier since 1905. So
that's right. It's interesting. Here's that sea tub adventure. And again, it ended up being a real quick trip, but you did end up getting menaced by this rubber octopus at the end of the attraction. And then the old Toonerville Funhouse was renamed Davy Jones Locker or the Deep Sea Locker. And by all accounts, it was an almost terrifying walkthrough in almost complete darkness once you went inside, with strange sound effects and weird blacklight paintings and maniacal laughter. And then there were these polished bamboo slides that you had to slide down to make your way out of the Davy Jones Locker at the end.
People always talked about the musk and the ocean smell being really strong in there.
Flying Dutchman was kind of an off-the-shelf dark ride, but definitely had a pirate theme to it, but it also had strange things inside it, like a kicking donkey and some barnyard scenes, kind of a weird thing.
The Flying Dutchman is banished for forever. That's the mystery.
And they had this wild mouse roller coaster called the Flying Fish. So again, they took the vehicles and they just painted fish faces on them. But you certainly did not have a lack of things to do at Pacific Ocean Park. You can say that much. Here's the Fisherman's Cove as it ended up with the restrooms with George and Martha flanking on either side. And they did have that Cape Cod architecture in parts of it, but parts of it they kind of gave up a little bit. This is one of the earliest hot dogs on a stick locations, if you can believe that. And it's interesting because every theme park or amusement park really needs a food and beverage area. We call it an F&B in the business. This is really weird to us because, I mean, it's Cape Cod architecture, but they're selling—
Where's the lobster?
Right, yeah, where's the lobster? Where's
I want some Cape Cod food, man. No, tacos, pizza, it's LA.
Right, where's the clam chowder in a sourdough bowl? I don't know.
Exactly.
Anyway. Down at the end, they took that old Stratoliner and they did the same thing. They painted them as fish and they renamed it Mr. Dolphin, but it was ostensibly the same ride. But the biggest, most interesting thing was the Mystic Isles section at the very end of the pier.
The Earl Newman painting there.
That's right. Yeah, Earl Newman, didn't he do interesting like beat era posters, Dominic?
Yeah, he was a Venice artist. He lived on the boardwalk and he did, you know, a lot of nightclubs, folk clubs and stuff like that, posters. And the Monterey Jazz Festival for 50 years, he did posters that looked like this, but he did about 7 of them for Pacific Ocean Park. Yeah, they're all Museum.
They're very interesting. They're very stylized. They're very rare. In the Mystic Isles section, they actually had an off-the-shelf. This is a little carnival ride called an Irely Octopus, and they actually went and sculpted this goofy Hawaiian Punch looking octopus on the top of the thing to give it some semblance of theme. And then the Deepest Deep Dark ride in that Quonset hut did actually open, but unfortunately, they designed the conveyance so complicated that it was broken and shut down a majority of the time. So not a lot of people got to ride the Deepest Deep. And it's really too bad because it looks like it had some really interesting things for people to see inside it, especially the monster that would attack you at the end. Fred Hartman actually pulled like an Ed Wood and basically raided this rubber monster from a soundstage that was in this film called The Monster That Challenged the World. So that monster is the monster that would attack you at the end of this ride. Like I said, unfortunately, not many people got to ride it because it was broken most of the time. There were games of skill and games of chance, like this coconut throw that had a heavy Polynesian theme to it. And then outside of the very end of the pier, there was an attraction called the Polynesian Trader Boats. And basically what these were boats that you could get on and that would take you on a tour of the Santa Monica Bay and all around Pacific Ocean Park. And the people who were driving the boat would tell really, really, really corny jokes as you went around. But probably, again, like we said, the most do not miss attraction at Pacific Ocean Park was the Mystery Island Banana Train. Let's take a look at that and listen to some of the things that you would hear while waiting in the queue for the train ride.
Welcome to Mystery Island, folks. Pacific Ocean Park takes pride in presenting the U.S. Rubber Train. Enjoy a trip through an island of your choice where you will see for yourself a dangerous fiery dragon, giant vampire bats, prowling headhunters, rare tropical birds, banana and papaya trees, bubbling lava pots, pass through a spider cave, and many, many other exciting features. Board the U.S. Rubber Train now and witness the earthquake that all your friends are talking about. This ride is for the entire family and will give you a thrill that you will long remember.
In other words, the ultimate tiki ride in history.
That's right. It's amazing. I mean, just the idea of walking over this giant waterfall to get in was pumping up seawater. And you got on these little banana trains. They actually pushed the guests rather than pulled them. They were designed by Aero Development, for those of you who are familiar with that company. And you went out into the jungle where you got menaced by headhunters and coconut throwing monkeys. And then you would go out and you would actually circle an active exploding volcano. And then from there, you go inside a show building where there was a giant earthquake happening. And then at the end, on your way out, you would get a nice view of the Gooney Bird, who would say this to you. Okay, that's enough of that. But what a fascinating attraction.
Is that the Mystery Island was sort of like a relaxing last outpost from LA. It wasn't a wild ride. It was just, you know, calm, cool. You're out on the ocean in bliss.
Right. These are some of the early graphics of Pacific Ocean Park that we really love. There was a lot of local promotion that happened. And then early on its first couple of years, all the attractions were ticketed, like Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm. So every attraction required a ticket. You can see there was a plethora of them. So what happened the second year of operation? Well, they tried to do a little expansion. It was mainly geared towards children and had kind of a clown theme to them as well. So you can see this clown here on the 1959 souvenir guide. And the reason they had the clown theme was they somehow had sweet-talked Emmett Kelly to come with some other clowns. And during summer of 1959, you could actually see Emmett Kelly walking around and talk to him. That other kind of terrifying clown sitting next to him, I don't have his name right now, but he worked for Max Sennett Silent Films at the turn of the century. So kind of interesting. And they also designed this thing called the Fun Forest, which was a smaller children's play area and had a very much a H.R. Pufnstuf kind of vibe to it, very stylized, wacky, colorful. And I really love these designs that Dave Constable did, but unfortunately the execution was not quite up to par with the rendering. So again, this kind of starts the slow decline of Pacific Ocean Park. You see something like that, and it's not, maybe not as appealing as it could have been. But it did have a much needed area for the smaller folks to ride. They had this dragon monorail that you'd ride around and little motorboats that you'd push and other little spinny rides. And then up in the upper right, that's something called the Haunted Tree Maze, which Dominic and I are hoping to find photos of someday because we don't know what's
in the Haunted Tree Maze.
Right. What's in the Haunted Tree Maze? We have no idea, but great name. They also had a petting zoo. And this monstrosity called the Space Wheels, where they basically took 4 Ferris wheels, kludged them all together where they would rotate up and down and backwards. It's terrifying. So during this time, they had lots of plans to add more things. The art directors and designers, they were going to add more of a tiki theme to everything. And some of these things do end up on the pier. They were going to have a new scene with the U.S. Rubber Company as a sponsor, more attacking natives. And then they were going to make this goofy giant sea serpent head for the sea serpent roller coaster that you'd go into his mouth right before you took off on the coaster. Also, there was new employee costume designs, and then a little meet and greet area with mermaids at the end of the pier by the Flying Dutchman ride. And there were also going to be these games of chance that were highly themed. Most of these things never actually happened, including this would have been fabulous. This is a whole tiki bar and tiki restaurant that they were going to design at the end of the pier. But unfortunately, they just decided not to spend the money on any of this stuff. And one of the reasons they decided not to spend any of the money on this stuff is this gentleman right here, Jack Morhart. He somehow convinced CBS and the Turf Club to sign over all of Pacific Ocean Park to him. At this point, the Turf Club and CBS realized that P.O.P. was not going to be a moneymaker, so they were glad to get rid of it, and this guy was glad to get on it. But part of the problem was they really stopped putting in money to the park. Some of the things they did in 1960 was this terrifying character dressed as the Easter Bunny who would come. I mean, if I saw this thing coming running up to me, I'd be in therapy for years as a little kid. Another really bad idea that they had was this surfing elephant, where they actually had an elephant and they manacled it to a board, which they dragged behind this boat. Terrible, terrible idea. Not good at all. The other thing that they did try to do to get more people coming in is they changed their admission policy from a ticketed approach to pay one price. So the new conceit was that you would pay a flat fee, you would come into Pacific Ocean Park and all the rides were quote unquote free. Other amusement and theme parks in the industry were not necessarily happy that they did this because there was a lot of money to be made from tickets. But as far as I can tell, P.O.P. is the first one to do this flat rate entry. And then Dominic, what was this? What was K-Surf?
Yeah, K-Surf was a radio station that was part of the original CBS and Turf Club era of spending money and doing something googie. And it remained to be a radio station in Santa Monica for a few years after P.O.P., maybe even into the early 70s. It was an easy listening station, automated. You know, I wish it was a Dick Dale and Beach Boys station, but hey.
Yeah, you would think with a name like K-Surf, it would have the coolest surf guitar music.
But we have this beautiful pictures of it, and somebody should make it again.
Right. There was also a strange advertising campaign they tried. 1960 was Nixon was running against JFK, and they came up with this odd character called Malcolm, who supposedly was a third-party presidential candidate, but who represented Pacific Ocean Park. Very strange.
Thank you, John Morehart.
One of the things that really did succeed at P.O.P. in getting people in, especially teenagers, was the advent of rock and roll, though, right?
Yeah, like here is like a probably 1964 era stand where kids could pose and be the Beatles. But, you know, way back in 1958 when the park first opened, here's a shot of the Buccaneers Den and the Johnny Burnett rock and roll trio who did Tear It Up and Train Kept a Rollin' and all kinds of cool songs. And you can see the little flyer on the right says P.O.P. Hop, the Champs, Ritchie Valens. It was a KFWB promotion. Here's the Champs on the left. They had the big hit with Tequila. Ritchie Valens opened for him. He had La Bamba and Donna and all them records out at the time. And then in 1960, KTLA brought a television show called Wink Martindale's P.O.P. Dance Party to the pier. And that ran every day, Monday through Friday, like after kids got off of school, 3 o'clock or something like that. And then on Saturday night, they had a special 1-hour edition. So it was the rock and roll every day at P.O.P. on the Wink Martindale show. Here's Wink with Annette Funicello, just before she did the Beach Party movies. And here's Wink with Johnny Cash on the P.O.P. pier, right in that old Sea Circus area we saw earlier. And also Sam Cooke, a local LA artist playing at P.O.P. on the Wink Martindale P.O.P. dance party. Now later on, Where the Action Is, which was a Dick Clark show from 1965, 1966, here's Marvin Gaye. So a lot of people TV was shooting there a lot, but Where the Action Is shot a whole lot at P.O.P. And this is from a 1966 Battle of the Bands. On the lower right is a group called the Fabs, who have one of those great songs on the Back from the Grave compilations, those 60s garage punk compilations. Now we got the Beach Boys at Too Hot Pin, the Cantonese restaurant on the International Promenade. And that's Al Jardine and Dennis Wilson. And, you know, the Beach Boys came out in 1964 and to promote the All Summer Long album at Pacific Ocean Park. And then again in 1966, they did promotion for Pet Sounds. There's Brian Wilson on the left and the lower right playing with all these games at P.O.P. outside at the Promenade. Now, this guy on the left is, I'm forgetting his name, Freddie Martin.
Yep.
And he took over Lawrence Welk's place at the Aragon Ballroom. And but that really wasn't going to be the direction P.O.P. was going to be going during the 60s, because soon enough, like the Teenage Fair happened. 1962, the director of Wink Martindale's show, Al Burton, put this whole idea of having a teenage fair. There's a George Barris car up on top. Jan and Dean was the headliner. Bobby V played. Soupy Sales was the host. So that really kind of brought more and more of the rock and roll kind of audience there. Here's Dick Dale with George Barris's wife at the table, the George Barris table, where all the hot rod cars were. And 1965, I believe, Herman's Hermits did a movie called Hold On, starring Peter Noone there and Shelley Fabre riding on the old roller coaster. And this is Dean Jones and Connie Stevens in a movie called Two on a Guillotine, shot also in 1965. So a lot of shoots were going on there, but the best shoot was probably the Twilight Zone, featuring Jack Klugman and Billy Mooney, and it was a special episode. You can see them in the mirror maze up on top there, all about how we shouldn't be going into the Vietnam War. It was a sympathy kind of thing.
So that worked for a while. It got more teens to come, but as you know, the real money behind theme parks is families with children. They're going to spend a lot of money. Teenagers traditionally don't have a lot of money to spend. And unfortunately, at the very end, they went through a litany of owners, but they brought in this longtime carny, Jack Roberts. And so if there was no money being spent before, it was almost non-existent now. And so what they did was, unfortunately for P.O.P, there were less and less people coming every year, and kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where instead of spending the money and putting high-end themed attractions that could compete with Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm, they just started putting in off-the-shelf carny rides, completely unthemed. So like this wild mouse in front of the Fun Forest area. And what happens is in theme parks, if you have not new things for people to come see, if you have attractions that are not new and engaging, less people are going to come. You're going to have less money to spend next quarter on new attractions, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where it starts to become a place where no one wants to go anymore.
And you compare that to K-Surf, right? That monster ride.
Right. But one of the very last things that they did try to do in 1967 was create this thing called the Cheetah, right, Dominic?
Yeah, in New York City in 1966, the original Cheetah Club opened, and the LA version of it opened at P.O.P in, I believe, April of 1967. And all kinds of the top acts, the Doors, the Byrds, you'll see pictures of them later. But also, two of the most interesting things were Pink Floyd, when they had Syd Barrett in the group, played there, and also Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin. So let's see some stuff. And there's Jim Morrison of the Doors. One of the last shows there was Howlin' Wolf headlining, with Creedence Clearwater Revival opening up in '68.
So cool. You know, and just like 5 years earlier, you had Lawrence Welk and big bands playing there. It's crazy. Well, so they tried this with the Cheetah Nightclub. Again, it got more teenagers coming around, but didn't really help. They still weren't making as much money as they needed to, even to just basically stay open. And the kind of final nail in the coffin for P.O.P was the Santa Monica Redevelopment Association. So early on, Santa Monica was very much behind being a booster for P.O.P. But by the mid-1960s, the writing was on the wall that the city of Santa Monica did not want Tawdry Amusement Park Pier there. They decided they were going to tear down all the little downtown section and all the little homes, and basically build expensive high-rises and condominiums, which is what happened. So unfortunately, in the process of doing all the demolition, they ended up shutting down the main thoroughfare to Pacific Ocean Park. So even if someone wanted to visit P.O.P, they would have the worst time trying to get there. They would say they could see it, but they couldn't figure out where to park. And
that shutdown was like from 1965, 1966, and 1967, 3 years while the park was trying to operate.
Yeah. So unfortunately, by '68, they were forced into bankruptcy. They had a giant auction where everything was sold for pennies on the dollar, and you could come and pick through the ruins. And unfortunately, within the year, Pacific Ocean Park, the elements really took its toll. The whole pier basically started to decompose. There were several proposals to put in new high-rises there, including former owner John Morehart. He actually wanted to build a 30-story hotel in the water right there, which I'm not sure is the best idea in the world. That never happened. And by late 1969, they started doing demolition. But part of the problem was they could only demolish some of it because there were so many complicated different leaseholders and people who supposedly own parts of the property.
Yeah.
They couldn't demolish.
Cheetah was open for a year after the park closed.
That's right. And so what happened was it was all shut down. It was kind of falling apart, and then the fires started. So in 1970, the Aragon Ballroom burned to the ground and took a third of P.O.P with it. You can see the smoking ruins of the Aragon Ballroom there. And again, it took out several dark rides and things, but for some strange reason, the carousel building stays standing. And then the pier itself started to really suffer. There were giant holes that started appearing in the decking. So extremely dangerous for anyone who needed to go on the pier for any sort of reason. There's just trash and garbage everywhere. On the right, that's the mural from the Deepest Deep Dark ride, like with the Quonset hut ripped off and exposed to the elements.
Only good picture we have of it.
That's right. And then local homeless people started moving in. So there were alcoholics and homeless people setting up camp both inside and outside of the pier. Someone crashed their truck into things. And then underneath the pier was probably the most dangerous and scary place. You did not want to go underneath the pier for any reason. Again, there was a big homeless population living under there.
Junkies too.
That's right. But one of the things that's interesting is there is a group of people who very much wanted to go underneath the pier, and that was the locals of Dogtown, AKA Venice. So there were always surfers in the Venice area. They would always surf around Pacific Ocean Park while people waved to them. But this is kind of a rougher crowd in the early 1970s. A lot of this was spearheaded by these gentlemen, Skip Engblom, Craig Stezik, and Jeff Ho. And they opened the legendary Jeff Ho Surfboards and Zephyr Productions, surf and skate shops. And these guys and a lot of the locals, they basically reappropriated the ruins of Pacific Ocean Park and turned it into their own private surf spot. So let's take a look at what some of those images look like. Remarkably dangerous what these guys did. Surfing in and amongst the pilings, just taking your life in your hands, literally. So I can't believe this, but basically for 6 or 7 years, the ruins of Pacific Ocean Park stayed undemolished, sitting out there rotting in the sun. And the big reason that a lot of it remained undemolished was P.O.P sat right on the line of demarcation between Santa Monica and Venice. And the two cities basically went to war with each other. Who is financially on tap to demolish this pier? And so while they fought that out, it sat there rotting and catching fire and catching fire and catching fire, to the point where the Los Angeles Fire Department just stopped responding to calls because what was the point? Again, there were lots of homeless people living in the abandoned storefronts, graffiti everywhere. I just can't imagine an eyesore like this standing today for more than a year, much less 6 or 7.
And much less people letting their kids run around all over it, which is you'll see in the pictures here.
Yeah, and just the parts of the pier just starts folding in on itself. We really like these photos. There's something beautiful in the decomposition of all this.
Davy Jones' locker.
Yeah, and there are those kids. And Dominic, like, didn't they have a security guard to try and keep locals out?
Yeah, one security guard to keep locals out. Ain't gonna work.
That's impossible.
All those surfers own the pier, you know?
Yeah. So the last kind of great fire happens in 1974, and it takes out the old administration building with it. And that's kind of it for P.O.P. At that point, they get their act together and they actually hire some demolition companies to get in and take out the rest of it. But these photos that we're showing right now, they're all shot by local kids.
That's a carousel. It's a Flying Dutchman. No Stratoliner.
The pier ends up, the old Stratoliner and the Mr. Dolphin ride, they built it so tough that it actually did not fall apart. And what they had to do was they had to get a tugboat and they had to go out and attach a cable to the Mr. Dolphin ride and actually pull it into the ocean. So you know, there are warnings in this part of Venice by the ocean saying there's stuff under the water and be careful. We don't know if there are parts of it down there still. And then the final humiliation is taking the wrecking ball to the beautiful mid-century modern entrance to Pacific Ocean Park with the Santa Monica Shores Towers looking on in the background. The decking was basically unusable. It had been so covered with creosote and tar and pitch, they couldn't reuse the wood. So the rumor is that they trucked it out to the Mojave Desert, and this is supposedly the ruins of the P.O.P pier out there. And then, believe it or not, this is what Pacific Ocean Park looks like today. There's no pier, there's no sign, there's no placard, there's no mention that would tell anybody from Los Angeles that this pier was ever here, something that went back to the late 1800s, which is kind of a tragedy.
Yeah, that pier was in Los Angeles, in a part of Los Angeles for 80 years.
All right, so that is our presentation. Thank you everyone for hanging in there and watching it with us. And I think we're going to go ahead and take some questions and answers now.
Excellent. Well, guys, wow. So what a tale, what a history, and thanks for giving us such a comprehensive view of all of it. It's striking to me that something that was a star that burnt so bright in pop culture for like a decade. I mean, you know, the celebrities that you chronicled that visited and the music acts. So, I mean, the representation of music acts alone,
yeah,
the stunning rise and fall of this place is really what grabs you, right?
Yeah. And it's shocking to Dominic and I that there should at least be a plaque out there. There should at least be something that you know, lets you know that this was once here. It was amazing in its day. How much it would have held up if it had lasted into the 70s, I don't know. It might have aged very badly and shut down then, but it absolutely should have some sort of a memorial, something to let Angelenos know that it once there, because what happens is, you know, in Los Angeles culture, we have so many people from all around different parts of the country and the world, and they just don't know about this thing. So I think people should know about it. I think people should be aware, right?
And I think it's a really important part of what makes Los Angeles. I mean, this was really one of the prime moments of LA's, you know, evolvement, you know, and it's a very colorful era. You know, the mid-century modern space age, Googie design and all that stuff of the 50s. You know, we see pictures, a lot of the 50s pictures we see are black and white. But when you do exhume a nice color photograph, you see how imaginative these things were. And then it moves in sort of the proto-psychedelic era, you know. I think that P.O.P has this imagination thing to it, like movies, and those rides are meant to bend your mind. So it almost completely evolved into that psychedelic era. Perfect, you know. It's just a lot of color and a lot of culture and a lot of important Los Angeles area character, you know.
Yeah, and you know, it's really hard actually to find beautiful full color photos of P.O.P. The black and whites definitely outnumber them. And that was something that we really wanted to get in the book, was the color that was part of this. And you talk about mid-century modern, I mean, they nailed it. So
yeah. Wow. Well, let's take some questions from our audience. We have a few. We'll start with Marty Tippins. Marty says, thanks so much for documenting this great piece of history in LA. Where did you source all the pictures and graphics?
Multi-year research. I mean, I think I started seriously researching Pacific Ocean Park, I'm going to say in the mid-90s. And so while working on other projects, I would, you know, try and track down both collectors of rare materials and people who actually worked on it. And the interesting thing is, I don't know, Dominic, you've probably found the same thing with your books, is that once you talk to the right person, there'll be one person who worked there who knows 5 or 7 people who actually worked on other things, people that you would want to talk to, and they'll say, oh, you got to talk to so-and-so, and you got to talk to so-and-so. The biggest coup was tracking down the park design director, creative director, Fred Harpman, who has passed away, unfortunately, but he lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And he called me up like the week after 9/11. And I got on a plane like the week after 9/11 to fly to Santa Fe, New Mexico, because he had all kinds of amazing original artwork and photos. And even at the 11th hour, there was a guy who ended up with a lot of concept art that some of it we'd seen, but some of it we'd never seen before. And unfortunately, we got it too late to go to print with. But so there's stuff out there if you dig, but it's not necessarily easy. I'll say that.
Let's check my Greek pronunciation. John Leonidakis. You can type in the comments if I got that right, John. What was the total cost overrun with Ville, he says?
Ooh, couple million. I have it somewhere. It's in the book. I apologize. I don't have that number memorized, but they had a budget of $3 million and they went over by a couple. And then additionally, one of the things that made CBS and Turf Club kind of start getting nervous feet by 1959, they crunched the numbers financially and they realized that Pacific Ocean Park would probably never make money, at best break even if they were lucky. So CBS wanted out, Turf Club wanted out, and that kind of made it easy for a real estate developer like John Morehart to sweep in. And John Morehart, even though they say in the newspaper clippings that he bought it, he actually didn't buy it. He actually did basically a swap with them where he assumed all debt and all liability in exchange for taking the whole park. But he realized pretty quickly too that it was not a moneymaker, it was a money loser. And so that's how you get this horrible cycle of putting up throw-up rides and carnival rides. And people are like, why would I come to Pacific Ocean Park to see that when I can do it at any local carnival? So it was kind of
a lot of theme parks in LA in the 60s, and there was, by that time there was competition. You had Enchanted Garden and Japanese Village out in Buena Park. There was Knott's in Disneyland, but Jungle Land, there was all kinds of joints, and I remember asking my mom to take me back to Pacific Ocean Park in the middle 60s, and she goes, oh no, it's kind of running down there now, So Chris, I have a question. Like the cost overruns kind of came from people were wedging here and wedging there when they were like, you hire somebody and they build and they oh, we want to do more, we want to do more. You think maybe if Doc Strub was around to run things like a tight iron ship, like you mentioned at Santa Anita there, he might have been able to keep those cost overruns. Because I think it was pretty much all these cost overruns that happened in 1957 before the park even opened that caused it to be impossible to get that back in 1959.
Yeah, I don't know. Short answer is I don't know. Part of the problem is there was a lot of grift. There was a lot of, hiring, well, hey, you got to hire my union buddies and they're not maybe doing what they're supposed to be doing. So some of that was going on. But then just in general, in theme park design, almost every project I've ever been involved in, the initial budget, at some point, there are unforeseen factors that can double, triple, quadruple the costs in some cases. So if you don't have someone from a financial standpoint planning these things effectively from the get-go, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to end up spending a lot more than you ever estimated or budgeted for because of unforeseen things. So
plus the rides were out there, but those are complicated rides that are out in the ocean, and they're, you get that deterioration factor from the sea, which they didn't count on that too.
Right. And then also the fact that Pacific Ocean Park was open seasonally. I think we in Southern California, we kind of tend to forget what things are like on the East Coast, so places like Coney Island were only open when the weather was good enough for them to be open. And that was the case with P.O.P. They couldn't be open year round like a Disneyland or a Knott's Berry Farm or a Jungle Land because of the weather. It was impossible.
So to speak to the whole theme of how this went and how it was managed and its short-lived nature, Wendy Horowitz asks, does this park hold the record for shortest living attraction?
No.
No, that would be Sid and Marty Krofft's theme park in Atlanta.
Yeah.
Oh, how long did that last?
6 months. The world of Sid and Marty Krofft was open and closed in 6 months. And we're kind of fascinated by that park, actually, because it was they had an HR Puff and Stuff dark ride in the basement, and they had this crazy pinball ride where you were the pinball inside a pinball machine bouncing around. It was done and dusted in 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Michelle Modgoin seems to remember a Tunnel of Love. Is she right?
Well, if you consider the C-Tubs attraction, the Tunnel of Love.
Yeah, that would be it.
Yeah, if you think about a traditional Tunnel of Love attraction, slow-moving boat ride in a building in the dark with little scenes for things for you to see, but the real purpose is for you to get a chance to snuggle up with your significant other and get close to them, and that's where the love part, I guess, comes from. So C-Tubs was definitely kind of a Tunnel of Love type attraction, I would say, but it was also very short too. I think that whole ride probably wasn't more than 2 minutes long. So
this is a question for Chris. It's Dave Cobb asking if any of the Imagineers of the day worked on the attractions.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Fred Harpman, who was, again, I can't believe they made him the creative director for the entire park at age 30. That's mind-boggling to me. He worked on Main Street with Harper Goff and Wade Rubottom. And Jim Casey, who you saw sculpting, he was the main sculptor of P.O.P. He's the guy who was hacking the tiki poles out of the telephone poles on the pier. He actually worked with Blaine Gibson on 1960s Jungle Cruise. So he sculpted a lot of like the elephants in the Sacred Bathing Elephant Pool. And he also worked on Tokyo Disneyland. So if those of you who remember the Cinderella Castle mystery tour of Tokyo Disneyland, there were some giant sculptures, and there was kind of a king with a big sword, with kind of a bowed head. Jim sculpted that, and he sculpted that in his backyard. And Jim did a lot of stuff he did a lot of tiki restaurant work. So a lot of these places like the Islander and Don the Beachcomber and things like that actually have these wooden carved tikis, and Jim would do those in his backyard. So.
Wow.
There are others. There's a lot. Christian Hope, not Christian Hope, excuse me. His uncle Fred Hope worked on P.O.P. and Fred Hope worked on a lot of Disney projects. There's others too. I'll have to think about it.
Stephen Silverman wants to know, besides the seahorse from the entrance of the History Museum, thanks for the shout out, Stephen, are there any other tenants still surviving, particularly from the rides, a carousel horse?
I don't, the short answer is we don't know. Do you know?
This is what we call pieces of P.O.P. I remember one time I was talking to this guy, Jeff Stanton, down by the beach, and he was able to recall where some of the rides were actually sold to different like parks up in, like the off-the-shelf rides would go somewhere here in Arizona or Washington. But there are larger pieces of Pacific Ocean Park around. I mean, Chris, but they're all in the hands of collectors. Talking to the New York Times, they were saying you should try to find those pieces and make a museum show out of it.
Right. I do know, and I can't recall, it's somewhere in notes, the Skyway bubbles, the circular ones that took you out over the ocean, those ended up in another park somewhere, like repainted. And I think a collector got his hands on one of those when they finally went away. Trying to think what else. Oh, this is a weird one. Friend of ours, Ken Stack, who's doing a theme park museum, he came up with a photo. I couldn't believe this. After Pacific Ocean Park went into bankruptcy in the late 1960s, SeaWorld bought the King Neptune figure. And King Neptune was out in the sun, cracking and blistering for photo ops for people visiting SeaWorld in San Diego. So a lot of these smaller parks would probably they went to the bankruptcy auction and bought a lot of these things. And then of course there's artwork and props and things in private collections. And I think Dominic, didn't you? Someone asked about that. I want to say Shea, the big clamshell. That's it.
Oh yeah, Shea J out. Okay, the famous bar in Santa Monica, Shea J, which I hope is historically preserved now. I hope. Do we know? But anyways, there's a big clamshell on the side of Shay J in their intimate parking lot there. And that clamshell is from the entrance.
Right, from Neptune's courtyard.
Oh, cool.
But I would, again, once this pandemic is over, we can open some things back up. I strongly suggest all of you go to the Santa Monica History Museum and see the original fiberglass seahorse, because it's massive. And it's so cool that they found that. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Carrie Swing wants to know, she's asking, do you think the Gooney Bird at the end of the banana train ride gave rise to Gooney Bird acid? And I have a follow-up question to that. What in the world is Gooney Bird acid?
I'm going to let Dominic field that one.
I love you, Carrie Swing. That's all I'm going to say to that. She's funny.
I've never heard of that.
We don't have all that much on the Gooney Bird, but we did have his voice, right?
Yeah, it's so wacky. It's just, you're on this ultimate tiki ride, and then the last thing you see is this clutch of giant eggs, and this goofy bird pops out and screaming, "Thanks, I hope you enjoy your trip." We didn't talk about it too much, but if you look at the book, there's so much that's weird and left field, and just, why did they do that? You look at a lot of these things that they design, and you think, why did they do that? That's so strange, but it makes it interesting. So
clearly for people who took Gooney Bird acid.
Right. Right.
All right. Michael Brodsky wants to know where you find the concept art.
Well, there's a ton of it in our book. Again, a certain amount of it is in private collections. I think Peekaboo Gallery is going to have a auction this fall that has some of that Dave Constable artwork in it. I saw some of it. So that one image of the Deepest Deep where they're loading up in the diving bells and all the tikis are there. I think that one's going to be part of that. There are different collectors who have different pieces in there, but we've got a ton. I mean, we've got basically, we divided the book into 3 chapters, and one of the chapters is just full of concept art, because that's the thing that really drew me. Dominic was lucky enough to actually go to P.O.P. as a little kid. I'm a little bit younger, so I never actually got to go. But what attracted me to it was my mom went in the 1950s, and she saved a souvenir guidebook. And the whole guidebook was printed before the park opened, so it's all concept art. And again, it's all this concept art that's done by people like Dave Constable and Fred Hartman and people who were trained in the motion picture studio system. So there's this kind of 1930s, 1940s style of rendering and conceptual artwork and design that you see with these guys and women who are really way ahead of their time. And that's what really attracted me to it. I thought, is this a real place? Is this a place that existed? The concept art is so much better than what they built in most cases of the park.
I want to point out, like for example, we were talking about the Enchanted Forest and how it looked like the H.R. Pufnstuf show later on. Well, the H.R. Pufnstuf show was, notable for its, psychedelic, trippy, druggish overtones, the early Sid Marty Krofft stuff. And, here, this innocent thing that was made at P.O.P. was already going in that direction,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Some wacky stuff.
So in comparison, someone's asking if you ever visited California's Adventure, quote, Pier.
Mm-hmm.
And if so, what were your impressions?
Well, it definitely had that seaside carny look. I'm not gonna get into any descriptions or criticism because I actually work for Disney, so I'm probably not supposed to. But Dominic, did you ever go to California Adventure, the park right next to Disneyland?
Oh yeah. It's interesting. I like the way that they've tried to redo the Pan Pacific Auditorium and some of the old locations of Los Angeles, but somehow when I go there, I don't get that feeling of Hollywood. It's old Hollywood, so to speak.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's all right. There's a lot of cool stuff in there. I mean, it's just an expansion. And I really like the Bugs ride. It's funny, in the P.O.P. slideshow, we saw out on the Venice Pier or something, a bug ride. And then in the Ocean Park area, there's another bug ride that's all Art Deco. So this thing with bugs seems to work, man.
Yeah, that was called the Bug House. And it was a walkthrough fun house. But just the idea of, I don't know, calling something bug, it's like such a 40s weird thing. Again, there's There's so much weird about Pacific Ocean Park.
But the California Adventure, that I think is the best ride at the California Adventure, is the bug one, where you get to zap the bugs with a gun or something.
Okay.
Lon Cook wanted to know if there was some kind of loophole that allowed P.O.P to have dance halls on the pier when it was otherwise banned in LA.
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
You know, around the turn of the century, when Venice of America and Ocean Park both opened up around the same time, there were ballrooms. Now, at the Ocean Park Pier, we had the Casino Ballroom, and Venice had its own ballroom, and there was ballrooms all around the coastline, even in Santa Monica too. And it just seemed to be the natural place to go dancing in LA. It was really sort of strict and conservative in the city of Los Angeles. Venice, in the early part of the 20th century, was not city of Los Angeles yet. That happened in like 1926 or something like that. So Ocean Park and Venice were their own entities, and Santa Monica as well. They were their own towns, and they didn't have the same laws as Los Angeles. And it was perfect. It was by the beach, and we had this train that went out to the beach in those days. It was like our LA subway, the red cars, so to speak. So people come out in the red cars, and they'd go to all these different dance ballrooms. They really didn't care. I mean, the Sunset Strip didn't even have nightclubs until like the 30s, you know?
Jane Shirley wants to know if you can repeat the exact location of P.O.P.
Well, so if we were to give you an address, it's an address that doesn't exist anymore, but the way that you find exactly where P.O.P. was is you go out to the Santa Monica Shores Tower. Look at this image here. You see on the left those high rises in the background. Those are the Santa Monica Shores Towers, and those are still there. So if you can navigate yourself, because there's a bike path that runs along there. I mean, Dominic and I went out there a couple times and took pictures.
Yeah, it's just south of those towers on Ocean Park Boulevard, and it goes all the way down to Navy. So as a matter of fact, you know, where the Venice Boardwalk ends, the buildings of the Venice Boardwalk ends, is where Pacific Ocean Park would have been begun from the south.
So you have a guide for yourself. You should be able to, I mean, you could stand in that same location. I think you'd be in the sand, but you could stand right where the entry once was. So
cool. Yeah. This is a question for Dominic. Is this where Nancy Sinatra's Movin' with Nancy TV special was filmed?
Yes. As a matter of fact, this slideshow was created a bit longer and with video. When Chris and I did a book tour when it first came out, and we took it to New York and some places all over LA, and we had the Nancy Sinatra dance segment with David Winters is a big part of it. It's like that's that transition from when it was a beautiful park into not a beautiful place.
It's so cool, and I for those of you who haven't seen it, I would suggest you look it up. It's from a special called Movin' with Nancy. And David Winter and the David Winter Dancers, it's basically an abandoned Pacific Ocean Park at this time. And they do this whole go-go dance routine with Nancy Sinatra dancing through the ruins of the park. It's unbelievable. And, you know, we took all the video out of this presentation because we wanted people who don't have as strong internet connections to not have the buffering, but it's so cool. You have to see it.
But with the Nancy Sinatra special, it was cut close enough to the closing of Pacific Ocean Park where they were able to turn on all the waters in the entrance. And I keep forgetting the name of the entrance, Neptune's Courtyard. Yep. Yeah, the whole dance segment is in Neptune's Courtyard. And at some point, like, they're dancing in this dry, sad place. And his song is from Oliver, Who Will Buy This Wonderful Morning? And then it's kind of sad, you know, and the park is sad. But then all of a sudden they turn on the water and everything's great, you know. So it's this melancholy part of our regular slideshow, and Moving with Nancy has that.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so Chaz Gibson, against my better judgment, I'm going to ask this question. Was the Electro robot the same robot used in the Mamie Van Doren film Sex Kittens Go to College?
You know what? I got a feeling he's right about that, because I have seen Sex Kittens Go to College, and I think Electro's in that movie. That's a good one.
Hold on, I'm gonna look it up while you're talking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Electro. Electro was also in. There's a World's Fair movie from 1939. It's a short film that Westinghouse did, and Electro's all over that.
Cool. Don Rose.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Hey, Chaz, you win, man.
It's the same robot.
Yeah, Chaz.
That's so cool. I didn't even know that. Wow.
There you go, Chaz.
Yeah.
Donald Rose is asking, did any 70s preservation people attempt to salvage or sell off parts of P.O.P.?
When you say preservation people, that implies like a historical society. So not to my knowledge.
We didn't really have in LA the Los Angeles Conservancy, I believe, existed then, but in those days, the LA Conservancy was strictly about things from around the turn of the century and before. They were, that's why ModCom came up in the 90s, because nobody was bothering to save the mid-century modern stuff, and P.O.P. was definitely mid-century modern, and the appreciation of that didn't exist in the 70s, that's for sure.
Well, and not just that, but especially with the Santa Monica Redevelopment Association, the whole goal was to get rid of everything. I mean, because they wanted to make expensive high-rise apartments and condominiums, which is exactly what they did in that location. There was not really any thought that I can see other than let's get condos, let's get expensive real estate in here with a nice ocean view. And unfortunately, it happened at the worst possible time for P.O.P. So P.O.P. might have hung on until the 70s. I don't know. It's hard to say. But what interests me about it is it was such an obvious attempt to take on local theme parks and high-end theme park attractions. That's what's interesting to me about it all.
It seems to have been, again, the thing about the teenagers that comes, we see a lot of that more in the 60s, but from day one, Pacific Ocean Park opened up in 1958 without the kiddie rides. They didn't even think about the kiddie rides, right? And so it really was a place that attracted more of younger boys and girls that are interested in each other. Like that's why Disneyland was a little bit more family, and Pacific Ocean Park was a little bit more. All theme parks want to draw families, of course, but it was a go-to place for the rock and roll era kids for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to take a couple more questions, just because we're running a little over here, but I want to get a couple more. So, Nicholas, I'm going to butcher this. I'm sorry, this is tough. Nicholas Laskowicz, maybe. What other Southern California bygone amusement parks would you like to do more research on?
Ooh. This is a loaded. Well, first of all, I'm working on a couple of things that I can't mention right now, but one thing that's really interesting for me, and I did do a little work on it, but I'll probably never do anything with it, is SeaWorld as it was in the 1960s, because SeaWorld, again, had a very streamlined, modern, Polynesian pop look to the architecture and the design of it. And I just even remember going to SeaWorld in the early 70s and seeing, giant A-frame entrance structures and tikis, but then also this streamlined modern architecture like the Starkiss building. And then they had this Hawaiian Punch Tiki Village, which was this amazing thing. All this stuff kind of went away in the 80s, as a lot of Tiki Polynesian pop design things have, which is a shame. But I don't think I'll do anything with that, only because doing anything on SeaWorld with the animal rights abuses that have happened, that's probably not a good book to jump into. There's other things that Dominic and I have talked about. I mean, and then there's little things that people have focused on, like Jungle Land, and there were various alligator farms and ostrich farms over the years, and weird zoo attractions in the 1920s and 30s. Someone in chat's mentioning Beverly Center. There's a book on Beverly Center out that I've seen.
Yeah, there's some of the Kiddie Land near Beverly Center. There's Jay Jennings has a really nice book on that, and that's for local Hollywood people. That was the go-to place in town. There, a lot of, people really love that place. But I think one thing about Pacific Ocean Park, it speaks to this thing about once Disneyland opened, Los Angeles area had this great trend of new theme parks. So boom, boom, boom. They opened Pacific Ocean Park was the most ambitious one. Knott's had already been around, but they started to redo their thing once Disneyland became big, and they became bigger themselves. There's a place that I used to go to a lot, I used to love, called Enchanted Village. And it used to be connected to the Japanese Deer Park. And the original version of it, the Japanese Deer Park, was quite small. It was just, okay, there's these ladies that were pearl diving there, and there's a nice old Japanese house and a few other things. But Enchanted Village was like this little tiny Exotica themed theme park, and there's no pictures of it. Right, Chris? You never see anything about it, man. Enchanted Village. That's kind of, I look for the things that are missing, right, Chris? There's no.
Yeah, there's some stuff, and I just, again, I pulled up for the chat. Yeah, I think those are really interesting. They're actually stuff, and it went through. Enchanted Village was earlier the Japanese Village, which had some racially problematic stuff as part of it too, if you can imagine, in the 60s. And then before that, it was the Japanese Deer Park. So there's actually a whole litany of weird Buena Park attractions, things like the Cars of the Stars and various wax museums. One thing I was going to say, I'm going to share
this Von Dutch, house in the Hollywood Wax Museum. And I looked at that thing and I saw the entrance and I went, ooh, I don't like haunted houses. I don't want to go in there. But now I'm thinking, ah, dang, I would have loved to have seen the Von Dutch. Oh. And there's a really huge book on Von Dutch that shows all the interior pictures that exist of that Von Dutch haunted house inside of Hollywood Wax.
There was a lot of weird stuff in Buena Park. I'm going to share my screen again for those of you who are interested. I mentioned Monkey Island. I'm going to share this with you. This was this 1930s, 1940s attraction called Monkey Island, and it was on Cahuenga. And if you look, I mean, basically there are these giant plaster mountains behind it, and they had like 1,000 free roaming monkeys inside of it.
And the San Francisco Zoo also had this item too in it.
Yeah, it's very strange. So there is a lot to research about just Los Angeles and Southern California weird roadside attractions.
Now, there's weird stuff in Buena Park to this day. I think maybe tops the list.
Yeah, there's new weird stuff there, you know?
Like the miniature doll museum. I'm not sure if that's still there or not. And yeah, there's weird stuff.
All the Dungeons and Dragons type, or these large, things that like medieval times or whatever it is. I mean, they keep on making news. Like Buena Park is like a little Las Vegas and you don't even know it,
So Dave Tan and Patty Tan both asked about, I'm going to try to summarize the following in a couple of questions. Any history about the beach house?
The beach house.
I'm going to take that one.
Yeah. So what happened was that the Cheetah opened in April '67 and closed in after the last gig was in August of 1968. And then they took that old Seahorse Inn and turned it into the beach house. I think around November of 1969, it opened, and then it lasted all of 1970 and into the early months of 1971. I know that if you could imagine this, on Sundays they had a daytime jam session at the beach house. So this was during like the late 60s, so it'd be a lot of like a boogie rock kind of groups would be jamming in there and shit on Sunday afternoon. And but at night it was like the best two groups that I saw listed there were Canned Heat and the Flying Burrito Brothers, I think just after Graham Parsons left them. And there were other listings for like the Standells, but like after the Standells had lost all their main members, and the Seeds, except for it's just Sky Saxon and four guys. So the beach house was like a groovy club, but it was like a deteriorating place, a deteriorating era, and probably not one of the better clubs in LA at the time, but it was a club.
It's amazing to me to think in a span of less than 10 years, Pacific Ocean Park goes from very white bread, very clean cut, very family oriented, Lawrence Welk in the Aragon Ballroom, to full end hippie freak out. And, and then the pier shuts down, and the locals in Venice, the hardcore surfers and skaters take over the space and make it their own. They basically reappropriate the space as, well, this is ours. This is in our backyard. We own it. We're going to take care of it. And we're going to make it our exclusive domain. It's crazy.
It's interesting. The Dogtown and Z-Boys has made Pacific Ocean Park more famous than it ever was, because the people know about, like, skateboarders and surfers all over the world understand about that weird pier that, you know, they don't understand like the theme park part of it like we do, but they do understand that corroded version of it. And that's very fascinating to people all over the planet now.
Yeah. Yep.
And then, you know, there were a couple of questions. I know that you talked about this a lot during the presentation, but there are a couple of questions about celebrities and things that were filmed at Pacific Ocean Park. Specifically, there's a question about, you know, the Beach Boys, which was, you featured pretty prominently in episodes of Get Smart, and things like that that were filmed there. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Route 66 shot there. 77 Sunset Strip shot there. We saw Rod Serling, a photograph of Rod Serling with his kids there, and that great Twilight Zone episode. Get Smart. Oh, the Outside Man movie after the park closed. This French movie. I believe Jacques Demy did it. So, Chris, how about some other ones that we know about?
Well, there's a ton, and of course, I can't. You know, I mean, there's the Man from U.N.C.L.E. and
Uncle one's really good.
Name seriously, it's almost like, you know, throw a dart at any mid 1960s television production, and it probably shot there. It was really easy for the local, you know, studios to go, right, we need to do a carnival seaside pier thing. Let's go down to P.O.P. And P.O.P. was glad to have them come shoot down there because they needed the money, right? So, you know, there's a whole, and I don't have them all in front of me, but if you go through the book, we've got a pretty exhaustive list of television shows and films and things that were shot at P.O.P. Going back to the turn of the century when it was, you know, 1920s and 1930s, there are silent films shot there.
Oh yeah, you know, I was mentioning that we saw that Noah's Ark ride. There's a completely hilarious Charlie Chaplin segment done on that Noah's Ark, and Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd and all these people did shoot films down there. And the Ocean Park Pier, the real great version of it, that before P.O.P. there was a version that opened up in 1911 and 1912, and it burned down. But there was, I think, Mabel Normand shot a film out there at that time. So there's a little piece of footage of the Ocean Park Pier when it was in this original, most extravagant early 20th century form. And it lasts about 13 seconds. And you see people sitting on the boardwalk, but there it is, like in moving action. Wow. So, yeah.
And I feel like I got to get this last one in because I don't want to be in trouble with anybody whose last name is Merritt. So this is for Dominic. This is from Rob Merritt. Are there any compilations of video or kaleidoscopes of complete musical shows like Wink Martindale's?
The Wink Martindale TV show does not exist at all. We got all those photos from Wink up at his house. He had a bunch of leftover shots, like that shot of Johnny Cash and the shot of Sam Cooke. But those old rock and roll television shows from the 60s, only into about 1966, you know, they weren't videotaping any of them. Like Lloyd Thaxton kept a few of those old shows that he did. Only 40 out of 600 shows existed, though, you know, like videotape in those days was 1 hour long, and it was like, I think, $400 an hour for tape. So they just would use tape over all the time, and the rock and roll shows were just considered, you know, kid trash, you know, like a kiddie show practically.
You would think a kinescope or something where, you know, they filmed the broadcast would exist somewhere, but
yeah, we've looked really hard, and of course ask Wink. I know Al Burton, he just passed away, but you know, those guys just have nothing.
Yeah, I think I read the term kaleidoscope. It would be pretty tough to film through that. Hey guys, thank you so much for doing this. It was a lot of fun.
Pure stuff. We loved it.
Thank you to our audience. Thank you to Chris and Dominic. Guys, this is a lot of fun. We got to do it again.
Great. Thank you guys. Have a great night.
Take care.